All right. I think today, actually, Vispi, maybe I'll begin with answering your question. I think this is the fastest ramp up I have seen in attendees of any session so far. I'll attribute it to you and Umesh, and not the timing in the morning, because normally we do this at 5 p.m. in the evening. But
I have a different theory, Alok, which I'd like to propose.
Sure, please go ahead.
It's the topic. I think a lot of people are looking to find havens outside of India, given the situation. The topic is
True. So, maybe with that, let me first of all welcome everybody. And thank you, Umesh, and thank you, Vispi, for joining us. I'll maybe begin with saying welcome back, because we initially started Saas Talks with the objective of doing 10 sessions. Intent was to pick very micro topics. It could be anything from pricing to sales operations to product marketing. We have picked very micro topics. We always invite one anchor guest, and the intent is more to have a discussion format as opposed to a panel format. The way we do this is that initially I ask a few questions more to set the tone and the context with the anchor, and then it's open to everybody. And I know most of you have attended in the past. So today we are changing the format a little bit. The topic was such that I thought it'll be good to have not one, but two anchors. So with that, let me first introduce the anchors. So the first one is Umesh Sachdev. Umesh, I think I have known from now 2013 or 14. He's the founder and CEO of Uniphore, which is one of the leaders in the conversational AI space. I've even now forgotten how much money Uniphore has raised, because every year it goes by an order of magnitude. So you can't even keep track of it at this point in time. But very happy to see how Uniphore has become a market leader globally in its space. And Umesh has spent time both in India and in US, and I think will bring a very unique perspective to the topic. Also want to welcome Vispi. Vispi I got to know first time in 2014. Vispi was the first angel investor, at least to my knowledge, in Whatfix, and was also on the board of Whatfix, which is how, at least when I was at Helion, I had a chance to be part of the Whatfix journey as well, and spent many years sharing the board with Vispi until Vispi decided to come on board with Whatfix itself, and now heads global sales based out of the Bay Area. And Vispi has also been an avid angel investor, was also a venture investor for 9 years in the Valley, has seen tons of enterprise software, enterprise SaaS companies in his past. So again, this will be very, very useful. So the topic for today, which is what Umesh was referring to, I think most SaaS companies from India end up going to US market or other Western markets at some point in time. And it will not be unfair to say that the bulk of SaaS companies actually target US as one of their primary markets, if not the primary market. And most of the companies initially start with remote sales, which has been one of India's strengths. But for many of these companies, as volumes grow, as the companies become larger, for many of them, ACV also begins to grow. And they begin to toy with the idea that do we need to have a US presence? And it's a pretty non-trivial call for founders to make. They're always worried, should I be in India? Should I be in US? Who do I hire? If I need to hire, how do I hire? What's the right timing? All those questions. So that's the intent of today's discussion. Hope that you guys will find it useful. So I will launch into the questions initially with Umesh, which is that at what stage in Uniphore did you hire your first US employee, and how did you decide that that was the right stage to do it?
Alok, first of all, thank you for having me on these talks, and it's a pleasure to come back and talk to you about some of these topics, and also best wishes for Eid for all those who are celebrating in the audience. Alok, from my personal experience, look, we hired our first US employee a few months after I moved here, and I moved here in 2018, right? Which in itself, I'm sure we can cover that later, but by that time, Uniphore was a 9-year-old company, uh, post Series B. Uh, we had US customers where we were selling, like you said, from India and through partners, but we didn't have a single US employee till then. And even before hiring, I moved here, lock, stock, barrel, with family, wife and kid,
Right.
and took that plunge. And we can talk about why I made that move, or the unique scenario for Uniphore, that we were going after large enterprises, we were resetting our ACVs and things like that. But that's the quick answer, that it was mid 2018 when we hired the first US employee.
Got it. And this be the same question for you in the context of Whatfix.
Yeah, in the context of Whatfix is a really important preface, because every enterprise software company is different. Uniphore is a great example of selling to the high end of the market, a larger average selling price. For us, we were about 50 employees, and I would say my guess is we'd be at around 75 customers at the time. Our customers ranged from small businesses to enterprise, but even at the enterprise, we were selling at the manager level. So we were doing all that without any US employees, all from India, with an inside sales team from India.
And Vispi, I'll ask in the reverse order. With the benefit of hindsight now, would you have done that any earlier or later?
Yeah, we tried to do it earlier and just couldn't find the right person at the time, or the right group of people. In hindsight, maybe only earlier, but with the other benefit of finding the right person. And I'm sure you'll talk about the success rate of hiring in the US later. So if you got that success rate wrong, the hindsight would be to have hired just at the right time or later. So in hindsight, a bit earlier if we had got it right.
Understand. And sorry, Vispi, just to drill on the point, Umesh mentioned that they started in US post Series B. And I know that some of these are very hard to put, because it could be ARR based, it could be number of employees, it could be stage of funding. In your mind, if you had to now advise an entrepreneur as to what's the right framework to think about when to hire, what would that be? Would that be ACVs? Would that be ARR? Or would that be amount of funding? What would you go with?
Yeah, really good, Alok. So I'd come back to the same preface of really enterprise software is different. Each of us is different. And you can look at there's no one size fits all. So let's look at the various sizes. At the most basic level, who are you selling to? Is it a large enterprise? Is it small? What's your average selling price? Which persona are you selling to? How long is your sales cycle, and more? That's at the very basic level, but it can get more nuanced. So look at a few bookends. Freshworks is a great example of one bookend where the average selling price is very low. It's almost low touch. Much of it is no touch. A lot of it goes through email. They didn't need anyone here for a while. And even today, if you look at their ratio, 4,500 people, and I think it's less than 6% are in the US. Their model doesn't require it. Massive, large company, the bellwether in enterprise SaaS in India, doesn't require it. You look at other bookends where, and maybe Uniphore is a good example, I don't know it well enough, but other larger companies that are selling higher average selling price to C-suite, that's really hard to do from India. So many flavors, Alok.
Got it. Umesh, your take on the same question. I mean, would you do it by stage of funding, ARR, ACVs? What would you say are the driving points to take that call?
So Alok, both from my experience and before making the move, I'd spoken to several other entrepreneurs who had either made this move successfully or had missteps. I spoke to Anish at Capillary, Jaspreet at Dhruva, Cloud Cherry had moved here. So in my situation, I had the benefit of building up data points from several other founders as well. Look, from our vantage point, we made the move where I had three conditions fulfilled. First, in speaking with some of my other peer founders, I realized that I need enough fuel in the tank, because as soon as you land in the US market, no matter which route you take, you hire people first or CEO comes first, doesn't matter, your meter of expenditure starts to run much faster, right? And there's a runway, no matter how fast you are, that you'll have to invest before you start to reap the benefits of this wonderful market. So we needed enough fuel in the tank, and for us that event happened post Series B, right? So that was one. The second thing that I wanted to fulfill before moving here is that I was convinced it wasn't going to be good enough for me to know that my products are better than my competitors, that I was beating my competitors in Asia or India. For US market, I wanted to make sure at least in some category, I have a dramatically better advantage from a product standpoint. And that's because I was going to be in a very competitive, highly entrenched, deep pocketed American competitors. And so the only way I could have carved out a niche to begin with as a unknown brand was a dramatically better proposition. So at least in some parts of the product. And third, which I now call in hindsight, the X factor, having some partner, some investor, in my case, John Chambers, somebody who can lend you the initial credibility, the initial brand, not just for customers, but even for hiring talent. I mean, why would a good talent leave all the other options available in North America to join an unknown entity which has just shown up from India or Asia for that matter? So the X factor of leaning on a proxy brand which can lend you credibility. So having enough fuel in the tank, namely capital, convincing yourself that there's a dramatic advantage on the product, at least in some area, and having some sort of a safety net that can give you the acceleration. Those were three conditions, which in our case, I would have loved for it to have happened before 28. It just wasn't there.
So, Umesh, you did mention that you moved first before anybody else got hired. And I know this is also a topic very debated in the industry, right? I have seen some founders who believe that they should continue to be in India and they should do the first few hires in the US. You decided to move first. Do you have a view on whether one of the founders needs to move to US before you can hire anybody else?
I have an extremely strong view here, extremely strong.
Okay.
And I know that Jaspreet, Anish from Capillary, Vinod from Cloudcherry, and Girish from Freshworks would now agree with me, and I'm sure Vispi would as well. Look, if you have realized that for your startup, US is not one of the few important markets, the most important market. Yeah. If you have reached that conclusion, then I would say the ideal situation, if one can have it, is not even a founder, the CEO needs to move. I have a very strong view. And the reason is very simple. Despite having the three preconditions checkmarked, everyone needs to land here and readjust the product market fit. There is no way, right? Even if you've been selling from India or whatever, you're coming here for a reason, either to capture a bigger share of market, reset your ACV, go after a larger segment or whatnot. And it's not just true for Uniphore's experience, it's also true for places where CEOs didn't show up, let's say a CTO co-founder showed up or whatnot, right? So the data points are remarkably clear in this case. The CEO needs to come in, be the initial salesperson, essentially not to sell, but to re-establish product market fit and be agile in making modifications or changes for the US market, which may not be obvious if you're not here in the US. And that's why I think that the CEO has to move here.
So Vispi, for all practical purposes, you have been a founder of Whatfix too. I know you started and Vara moved here, but do you have a different view than what Umesh?
Yeah, Umesh's thoughts provoked a lot of additional thoughts for me. My original answer is, let's take the stage of the company. At the early stage, again, based on all research and practical living, the first X number of customers have to be sold by the founders. And there's no, until you get some playbook, it's hard to replicate that. So that has to be done. And my thought was, if that can be done from India, if you're selling to the US, that's okay. But if you need to do it from the US, you need to move here there. Then I was thinking about Umesh's answer. And I was thinking, man, what kind of CEO? Are there two kinds of CEO? Whereas one is very customer facing, customer centric, marketing centric, that needs to be where the market is, versus one that needs to be where the people are. And, you know, since you mentioned Freshworks, there's 4,500 people in India. And I forget, a few hundred in the US. So if Girish is here, then someone else is running 4,500 people, because that's not possible. So I wonder if there's a nuanced answer in there based on whether the CEO is customer facing or more people centric.
I've already taken my 10 minutes. That's all I was allowed. And this was more to set the tone. I do want to open it up to everyone to ask questions. And you can either just raise your hand and we can bring you on the screen here. That's option one. You can put your questions on the Q&A panel. That is option number two. So both are possible. And I'm assuming that Umesh and Vispi are gurus of this topic. They may not need to ask a question, but if they want to ask a question, they should feel free to ask a question as well. So there is no, at this point, it's an open for discussion. Also, Arpit, if you can bring Manish, Ketarpal.
I am, yeah.
And Apoorv, you can respond if you want through WhatsApp to Arpit. If you can come online as well, because I know you brought metal to US way back. And that was one of the first SaaS companies from India. So if you're okay, we would love to bring you in as well. I think it'll be a very rich perspective that you can offer as well. So while people are still asking their question, okay, somebody has already asked. You can bring an Apoorv also, actually, Arpit.
I brought an Apoorv. He should be here now.
So let me welcome Manish. Manish is the founder of Waterbridge Ventures and a dear friend for a very, very long time. And Apoorv is an ex-colleague and now an entrepreneur. He has founded Elevate.so and previously brought metal to US. And I'm forgetting when it was, but it was way, way back. So different people with very different perspective. Let me begin with the first question, which is for Umesh, which is that you did talk about having runway in the bank, runway from a cash perspective. How much runway is good runway to move to US? And others can answer as well, of course. But please go ahead.
Well, very clearly, that's a very subjective question to the situation of the company. What's your burn rate? What type of setup that you're going to have to need to set up the US presence and things like that. I'd say that if you estimate your first 15 months in the US, multiply that by 1.5 times, that's the minimum I'd say. And the reason I say this minimum is, I'd spoken to Jaspreet at Dhruva. He told me he raised around, just before coming to the US, he had solid cash flow coming from rest of the world. And he literally took a call to shut down that cash flow just to focus on the US, burned through everything but the last 2 months of that funding. And then the business started to take off, right? And which allowed him to raise the next round and things like that. My situation was pretty similar. When we raised our Series B, I diverted most of that funding towards my US move, where Asia and India were humming along. We were doing relatively well, but we almost sucked out the oxygen from that part of the world to focus on US. And we got lucky that within 8 months of me being here, we raised our C round. But that only happened because the customer traction had started to come about.
Good framework, actually. Apoorv, you are on mute. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Alok? Yeah, we can hear you now.
Great to be here, Alok. So just quickly adding on to that, I think, depending, and this, again, the view here is at what stage do you go to US and try to, because like Umesh said, you'll have to make that decision that you'll have to paralyze other businesses to pump in whatever you can in the US. This is assuming that you have US as your priority and not one of the few markets that you're targeting. And the stage at which we went, we had allocated $1 million to this. And that was, just purely in terms of numbers, we had raised about $4 million at the point, was not nearly enough. And we were always fighting because this was the decision that, hey, India is doing fairly well. And once you land there, you have to make this decision that I'm now going to have to change the entire product direction. I'll have to put on hold all these demands from Indian customers. Like, it's a fairly non-trivial decision. Umesh said that we sucked out the money from everywhere else. Like, this is probably where most founders trip, to make that judgment call. And if you go early enough, you'll actually probably be wrong in sucking out all of the money from everywhere else because you don't have enough runway. So, I think to his answer, I think probably it was the right time because there was enough to be done. But
No, it's an excellent point. If I may add one thing, that there is one company that I have worked with where we did take a call to move very early to the US. And it turned out to be a wrong call, actually, in hindsight. And that's not because the market was not there. But when you're too early, you don't have enough money in the bank. Also, it depends on the kinds of customers in the sales cycles. Different kinds of sales cycles require different amount of money in the bank as well. And we faltered quite badly. And so I want to welcome Anand from Guairo. Anand, please go ahead and ask your question. I'm assuming you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, I did. Hi, good morning, everyone. Good evening. Umesh and Vispi, I had a question for either of you, given that you've made the move in the past. Whenever I read or see or hear folks talk about having made this move, the one thing that scares me is the fact that the US is a massive country. My time in the US, having visited, that's the one thing I always take away. So my question is, Umesh, to your point about having enough fuel in the tank and putting the CEO or a founder on the ground, is there a time zone angle to it? Is there an East Coast strategy versus a West Coast strategy, or is that completely dependent on what business you're in? But is there a strategy that makes it better, or is that not really a thing and you just go there and figure it out?
Vispi, I'm sure you have an opinion, but I did have a little bit of a culture shock with that time zone and the size of the country situation when I moved here. You know, doing business from India, I was even used to sometimes doing day trips from Chennai to Singapore and back the same day, right? Whereas coast to coast in the US, you can't do a day trip. It's a 6-hour flight. It's like going from India to somewhere in Europe, right? And not just time, but the cost of the tickets are also pretty similar. It's like doing international travel from a cost structure perspective. So it goes back to the point that everyone has been making, that your meter of expenditure just runs super fast by doing that. Of course, time zone matters, right? If you have European operation or East Asian operation, East Coast or even Central is better than West Coast, right? West Coast just becomes extreme. You have to do really early morning and really late nights, which is what Vispi and I are probably used to. But also there's other benefits of doing West Coast, right? I mean, it depends on what kind of perception and brand you want to create. You want to create a Silicon Valley high-tech company perception, then you use the proxy of the fact that your address is Silicon Valley, your initial network of mentors, investors are Silicon Valley. If you care less about it and let's say 95% of your customers are going to be on the Northeast of the country, insurance, financial services, etc., maybe it makes sense to just do the East Coast strategy. So it's very subjective, but I'd say in general, our view was our customer concentration wasn't just one part of US, it was all over. We knew that we were a relatively unknown entity landing in the US. And so tapping into the Silicon Valley network, tapping into the proxy of being a Silicon Valley company and using that brand, just holding on to straws, was important to us. So we picked California.
I just want to add a comment to many people posting questions from the chat group.
Yeah.
Please don't post it on the chat group. Please post it on the Q&A panel, because very difficult to look at too many different screens. I have 3 different screens I'm looking at.
I had exactly the same request. Thanks, hello.
Right. Somnath, welcome. I want to give you the floor, but give me a second. I want to read one question from the Q&A panel before we go there. Many people have asked, it's a tactical question, but I think an important one. When founders have to move to US, what kind of visa do they move with? What's the kind of visa? Because I'm sure many people face that. I don't know the answer, but if any of you know the answer, I think it'll be useful for other people as well.
Vispi, do you want to go for this?
I'm a US citizen, but our founder moved on an L1. Umesh, was it the same with you?
Yeah, I'd say the most likely route available today, right, is L1, because it's also a faster path to potentially green card if the founder wants to stay longer. And you can basically demonstrate an intra-company transfer, that you're an executive who's moving from one branch to the other. There is, last week, the Biden administration rekindled an idea of entrepreneur visa which is not just specific to India, but globally, that regulation does exist, but US has been extremely slow and poor in approving those applications. But if the new administration takes a different view, then I would encourage people to just stay tuned on that one and figure out if that's a faster, better route. But until that happens, L1 is the only option.
Can I just add a super quick comment to Umesh's response? We recently, Umesh, my understanding was exactly what yours was. Recently, we had 2 different companies and founders getting their O1 visas processed in super real quick time. So apparently, whatever, in the background, maybe with the new administration, the changes happen and priorities shift for Indians with high ability, extraordinary ability, and the high tech folks do qualify. I have 2 cases. It took me by surprise that they got O1 visas within like 6 months.
Very nice.
Let me welcome Somnath then. Somnath was a partner in McKinsey for a very long time until he decided to don the entrepreneur hat recently and is the founder and CEO of Prism Force. So Somnath, floor is all yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Alok. Thank you, everyone. Lots of things to unlearn and learn from me. So my name is Somnath. I had a question for you. Before you actually set up physical presence in US, what was your experience of working with, say, freelancer, sales and marketing kind of folks who work on a commission basis, or with partners which work on a relatively high commission basis? So any experience there? And second question would be, what has been the experience of hiring non-Indians into sales team, right? Both hiring as well as retaining?
Vispi, you want to start first?
I'll start. We didn't try advisors or commission-based, but another company that I'm associated with has found someone very good. So I think the answer is it's person-specific. The only challenge in all this is the ROI. That recruiting takes a lot of time. Recruiting advisors, commission-based folks takes a lot of time. So it's really looking for a needle in a haystack a little bit. Regarding US versus Indian, yes, we've hired US as well. And there are some distinct nuances. The mistakes we made as a company, which is commonly documented, is we didn't hire sales support commensurate with our sellers. So operations, training, enablement, marketing wasn't hired. And US sales reps are used to having more of that foundation than we had. And that's where we fell.
Thank you.
Actually, very interestingly, I'll just chime in. And oftentimes founders feel that, and I've seen enough founders complain that US AEs are lazy or don't hustle enough. That goes on to Vispi's point. Actually, they just like more support. If you give them that kind of support, then they ramp up a lot faster. But if you don't, you are most likely setting yourself for failure. And there's that conflict. You keep thinking that these guys are just lazy, but they're just I've had those personal conversations where they have expressed their frustrations that Indian companies just don't give me enough BDR, SDR support, post-sales support.
And so I want to disagree with both Vispi and Apur, and maybe slightly different perspective. Having sold in the US for many years, I think some of the best hustlers, hardest working account executives I work with are in the US. What it goes on to show is that an Indian startup's ability to hire the best account executives is actually close to zero when you start in the US. See, you think about an account executive in the US who's very good. Why would they join an Indian SaaS startup? Because there are thousands of them in the Bay Area, frankly, right? With probably big investors, whatever, especially if you are Series B, Series C stage variety, even at that point, forget Series A. I think it's very, very hard to hire the best talent. So to me, it's more a signal of the fact that you're not getting the best talent, as opposed to the fact that the good talent doesn't exist in that country, number one. Number two, I also have a very strong view that these commissioned salespeople early on are a bad idea. Because again, the adverse selection effect there is going to be even higher. Imagine again somebody very good. First of all, if you're very good, you don't want this 20% sales commission role to begin with. You want a job, and a good job at that. You want a job paying you $500,000 if you're good, right? So if somebody agrees to work with you, by definition, they're not worth hiring, by and large. And if they're coming on pure a commission only role, again, exceptions will exist. Of course, I'm making a very generic broad statement, but by and large, your chances of success are going to be very, very low.
And sorry, I'm just chiming in, but there's a topic that I think Alok and we have discussed often enough with some companies as well in our portfolio. I think whatever we have seen, initial churn on when you hire AEs ends up being quite high. And possibly because your expectation levels are like, oftentimes early stage companies think that we have hired some amazing talent. And then after 6 months, you realize that, people weren't as good as we thought they were during the interview process. Because in general, I mean, these guys are sales guys, right? So they are going to be able to do a good job of being able to sell themselves. And I think it does take that time. And I don't know what Vispi, Umesh, what you guys have seen, or Apoor, what you saw. But in general, at least what I've heard is it takes about 1 in 2 or maybe 1 in 3 kind of a hit rate before you start finding great people. And like, any thoughts on that actually also? I mean, that's a hypothesis I carry.
Arpit, my view is, the data point of first year, there being a high attrition rate or high churn, there's a different reason for that to happen, right? Not only, even if you had the ability to, let's say, use John Chambers in my case, and attract somebody really good and say, please take a bet on this company, I put my personal money on it, you still will end up in the same situation. And that's because in year one, fundamentally, the company itself is figuring out a lot of things in the US. Yeah. And the US AEs or directors or VPs of sales are coin driven, right? Unless they make or overachieve their commission in the year, it's not just the base salary is not good enough for them, right? It is the company's ability to give them the pathway. Unless you can give them a draw for the whole year that, no matter what, year one commission is guaranteed. You're just not going to be able to get a coin-driven AE or sales director to stay in the second year, right? So therefore, my theory is no matter what you do, you can be cat's whisker here. You will have that churn in year one because the model is not set.
And what you're also saying is no matter how mature you are, because US will be a different PMF that you had mentioned earlier. So that 1 year, 1.5 years, whatever, there will be this ramp-up process that the organization will have to go through.
Yeah.
Understood. Vispi, any thoughts? And I don't know if any different thoughts maybe for you, Apoor.
No, for sure, no different thoughts. If you haven't got PMF, then you shouldn't be here for sure at all. I mean, presuming you have that.
Understood. Okay. One other question, and I'm going through the question answers in the panel also. But before, any views on what functions make sense? So go-to-market clearly. I mean, and because a lot of our discussion so far has been go-to-market. But other than that, also, what are functions that make sense, or even maybe roles specifically, not necessarily entire functions, to keep in the US and others that you might want to keep in India?
I have a strong view. I'll just say product marketing should be right there, and that's it.
Sorry,
product marketing should be in the US, not sitting out of India.
Actually, Apoor will be good for if you elaborate why. Because there are a lot of people on the call, so it'll be good for people to hear the view.
So the nuances of we used to go to a lot of meetings. We were selling to HRs in India and HRs in the US. And the product team just thinks that they have pretty much cracked it, right? You've got the customer persona right. And they don't speak to customers enough. Product team doesn't end up doing that purely because of time constraints. Sales team, product marketing is the guy who's going to basically eventually bridge that gap between your sales and your product teams and your marketing team. The communication at the core of what your product, if you look at a product that goes from India to the US, you have done the communication entirely around India. The way your emails sound, the way your, message, everything, your product, the messages it throws up when an exception happens, it's geared to an Indian target customer. So someone has to look at all of this and just figure out now how will this entire company look when it's presented to a US customer. And that person has to be based in the US, understand the nuances of these guys, exactly how they talk, what triggers them, what challenges do they face. Usually what ends up happening, the CEO keeps doing that job for a long time, or the first person from the company. But if you have a specific person, this would be it to do that job.
And Apoor, if I was to go one step deeper on that, are you saying product should also be then part of it? Because a lot of what you described is ideally something that product managers should be doing.
Yeah, thoda expensive ho jata hai. I mean, if you can, great. But the only thing is you've got good product guys sitting out of India, but they just don't the time for you to explain what is happening there and translate. Like you sit on a late night call and you translate to someone else, and of course that's a bit of a challenge. If a product guy could be in the US, great. But otherwise, the translator should be a local person who's, at least you should know that the job of communicating is happening very seamlessly. Like there's nothing lost in translation.
Understood. And again, other views, or maybe just drilling down further on the same view also. But
Arpit, my view here is we should think about this question in two buckets. One is from a business standpoint, what functions make sense to be in the US, and second, what Apoor was going after is talent pool. Just there is some type of talent pool that India just doesn't have. Period. Like no matter what, you can't argue with me about product marketing, being good in India. That today that doesn't exist. Hopefully next few generations. But also business-wise, look, ultimately, as PMF happens, as your early proving out happens, then you're looking for velocity. You're scaling things up, right? So for velocity to occur, fundamentally, this issue of what Apoor was talking about, this time zone difference, you slowly realize that you need almost a full stack presence, right? At least at the leadership level in the US. You need AEs, they need SEs. SDRs probably you can still keep in India, inside you can keep in India or US, that doesn't matter. But engineering presence, product management presence, because ultimately what you're now doing is also working with the customer, assuming you've built good relationship, you've got good customer success. That customer is helpful in shaping your product, right? And again, velocity matters, right? You can still keep those functions in India, but you're just going to add friction. That set up the late night call, let's then meet 3 days later, late night again. So one is for velocity, you ultimately realize that as you grow in the US, almost a full stack presence. But from a talent pool standpoint, Apoor mentioned a great one, which is product marketing. One very underestimated role, which has a huge difference, like the gap is really large between US and India, is CFO. India does not have a good SaaS CFO talent pool at all. And by the way, several CEOs, I won't name one, which is potentially on a path to IPO, even after he coming to the US, realized that, man, this is so different, right? When you start to think about processes, systems, predictability, being ready for SEC reporting, etc., Indian CFOs do not have that experience, right? And again, it's not a judgment, it's a generation issue, right? We need to have 1 or 2 generations of successful SaaS companies going IPO or whatever for the Indian talent pool to develop some of those skills. So I'd say my learning also is earlier the better, that Indian SaaS companies should think about US CFOs.
Arpit, I polled some customers of ours, some prospects after our sales cycle, both ones we've won and ones we've lost. And we polled in the US, and we polled them in the form of, hey, you've gone through our sales cycle. You had an SDR in India, you had an AE in India, you had sales management over here, and now post-sales, you're in customer success. So if you had a choice to pick which function you would want local in region to you, what would it be? Any guesses?
Customer success.
Customer success?
Absolutely, hands down. It's who I'm going to spend the most time with. And the sales is gone after the sales cycle, but I'm going to be a year. And even though customer success is good in India, and even though you work a US shift, I still want that person here. So that was their perspective. Might not be the right thing for an entrepreneur to do, obviously, first off, but that was their answer.
But Vispi, a quick follow-up question. Did that make a difference in their decision? While it's a good wish to have, but would they not choose you if you didn't have a customer success?
No, but I'm really glad you asked this, Apoor, because due to the topic of the panel, the tone's a lot around moving to the US without any discussion about how much we can do from India. And that's my world, which I live every day, along with 15, 20 other startups who are competing for sales talent in India. In the US, from all the 3 regions that we're in, US, EU, and APAC meaning ANZ and non-India, the US is the most receptive to remote buying. Even pre-pandemic, very receptive. Pre-pandemic, we have closed 300K ARR deal from India. Not a single person in the US has talked to that customer. High-end, extreme, but consistent, and it's moving over time. In my 3 years, it keeps moving. Today, consistently 100K plus, net new, not even expansion, no relationship, etc., knowing fully well we're there. So I just want to make sure that reality and dynamic isn't lost as people are thinking about, when do I go to the US? You might not go for a long time because buyers are ready to buy from you remotely and from anywhere.
No, that's an excellent point, Vispi. Takes me back to 2013. I had just joined the venture profession, and I was trying to build my first SaaS thesis, and I met with Girish in Chennai. And the impression I walked away with was that if you want to sell deals with ACVs below maybe 2,000, 3,000K, India can work. The moment you go above $5,000, you just can't sell from India. And it is just fascinating to see how rapidly that bar has been moving up. And going back, therefore, to one of the beginning points of the discussion, that we think about frameworks of when to move to US. If ACV is one of the drivers, we might want to think as to what ACV today is possible from India, because that bar has just moved so rapidly. And as to your point, Umesh, on generations, I find that founders today, when I look at young SaaS startups today, their ability to set up these remote sales, go from 0 to 1, 1 to 5, is just so much more rapid, because there is a lot more existing talent which has gone through this journey in the past and experience in the ecosystem that didn't exist before. So in many ways, you could argue that this line of when to be in US is getting shifted in some ways too. So I know the gentleman from Luna Capital has been there for a long time.
Yes.
If you can please announce your name, and I believe you had a question because you raised your hand. So.
Hello.
Maybe, perhaps not.
Yeah, maybe not.
Alok, can I chime in with my question until then?
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you for doing this, first of all, Arpit and Alok. And Alok, with you there, and of course, Vispi and Umesh, feel like the kindergartner as far as SaaS goes amongst college graduates. We've only made two global SaaS investments. DataWeave has been an old company, been around for a while, and Atlan is relatively new. I think both are doing okay, but we have very little role to play in them doing okay. So I'm totally in the learning mode. I have a slightly, maybe culturally insensitive question, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. I only see Indian faces here, some maybe US citizens, so that's okay. My question, so Vispi, I totally buy your argument that the whole shift to US or whatever market, founders have to do the first few important sales and set that culture and tone right. Having said that, when I think specifically of the sales lead in the US, assuming US is the large market, are there any playbooks to what kind of people to hire? And the question is possibly culturally insensitive, because I've seen American white as a bucket that is a big bucket to hire from. Seen Indian descent, have worked in the US, speak the language, have the accent, have the experience, of course, for the sector is another bucket. And the third is, of course, founders transport either themselves or folks from India into that market. Is there one or the other better? Is that even is that how you look at your selection processes? Again, I'm thinking senior sales folks, because we do know certain kinds of buckets, let's just say, do sales roles better, especially if it's talking to US enterprise customers.
Umesh, would you like to go first?
Happy to. My answer is no, it doesn't make difference. The race or color of skin, definitely not. What you really want to look for is somebody who has muscle memory of the motion that this company wants to do. If it's SMB, if it's mid-market, if it's enterprise, somebody who has been there, done this, has muscle memory of at least the next 3 years of scale that the company needs to do. You will find those people having various skin colors and various races. And we have succeeded in hiring Indian descent people selling at really high. By the way, again, just to set context here, right? We're talking of different models. Uniphore's ACV, probably less understood, is $1.3 million. That's our ACV.
Whoa.
Okay, so we really in a different segment. Our motion is very different, right? And so my vantage point is probably going to be different from Vispi's, because Whatfix's ACV is different from ours. So, in my experience has been that I wouldn't spend a minute thinking about some of those issues. I'll just look for somebody who has had muscle memory of doing this motion, whatever the company needs to do.
Vispi, you have a point of view. And sorry, I should add some color to this. A lot of the founders, one is backing from here at least, who make the shift, actually also have had no experience of working in the US and managing cross-cultural, cross-racial teams. So that also adds a bit of complexity to at least some of those buckets, at least in my experience. Sorry, Vispi, would love to get your opinion too.
I'll start with your last. Yeah, I'll start with your last point, Manish, which is, I think the US is so forward that it's borderless and cultureless. And even if a founder doesn't have that, have ever been to the US, if you know your product and you've got product market fit, you have to do the first 20 sales on your own. Many blogs, many investor sort of videos and 101s all have that very clearly. So that part's sort of clear. I'll answer your other two. And I'd say there probably are some cultural differences between Indian descent and purebred in the US. But I think what trumps it all is what's the fit for you based on your motion, Umesh's point. And also, it sounds cliche, but it's so important based on your culture. I'll show you one or two nuances about our culture. One is that we have no dashboard manager. There's no one who's looking at reports and only doing dashboard. Everyone is hands-on. And that's what we believe. Now, so many companies you'll recruit from in the US that are leaders have been a dashboard manager for over 10 years. That just doesn't fit with us. So it's just one example of probably 3 or 4 parameters unique to you as a company and unique to your motion. The last one being Umesh's point.
Got it.
Very helpful.
Hey, Alok.
Hey, hi everyone. My question was like, given the pandemic and a lot of sales happening virtually all over, do you see a lot of the high ACV transactions happening more virtually than before?
Yeah, my experience, absolutely. Our biggest deal last year was a 7 million ARR. Now we did meet the customer once before the pandemic, but the rest of the sales cycle was all virtual. So, even for a company like us, high ACV, field operations oriented, world has changed, right? Our myth and notion of, look, you got to have demand gen SDR inside field, those stages are crashing, right? You probably don't need to have that demarcation of 4 stages, because fundamentally we've proven to ourselves that this is virtual sales, right? Our notion of being in physical proximity, having AEs who can build a relationship, play golf, whatever, that myth is broken now. And so the answer is absolutely yes. ACV is no barrier now to close business virtually with customers.
Okay.
Can I chime in? There are 2-3 questions which I wanted to combine. A lot of people have asked in different ways. Rohit Anand has asked that instead of hiring in the US, can you send an account executive from India? Somebody else has asked, can you hire by actually poaching from direct competition? And some others have asked, how do you hire? Right? I know that it's a topic which bugs many founders, because hiring account executives is very hard, and good account executives super hard. So those who have done it, and I'm pointing towards both Umesh and Vispi here, how have you hired? What are the sources?
Vispi, if it's okay, I'll start, right? 2 different time frames when I just came here first, let's say 15, 18 months to now. First 15, 18 months is quite honestly for me shooting in the dark, right? I had read enough blogs, I had enough sources, but like has been said, when you just land here, you are an unknown entity. Your ability to attract that top talent, even if you have a definition for it, is limited. We did, by the way, hire our first VP of sales from direct competition. And my 1-year theory that I was just telling Arpit played out. I don't think there was anything wrong with her. It was, our inability to meet her financial goals in year 1 played out. But what it did was allowed me to use that person's Rolodex, that person's experience of learning from her knowledge of US sales and this whole thing of, oh, I need AEs, I need some SDR support, without which I won't. So it helped. Year 1 was learning. Now, as we are scaling, we have about 35 between SDR inside and field in the US. Now it's really about the playbook is set. You kind of know what kind of people you need. I will go back to muscle memory, right? You know your motion. Now you're looking for people in different companies who have seen that motion. In some specific areas, you might need domain knowledge. In our case, we now no more care about domain knowledge because the contents and the playbooks are just supporting the reps, and it's scaling for now.
I'll add on the first one, on the visa one. We've haven't attempted it. We'd like to. It would work out really well. The challenge is the success rate of getting a visa for a non-technical person. When we've tried for technical people in engineering and customer success during the previous administration, it wasn't that successful. But otherwise, if you could do it, it would work out well. I believe MindTickle might have done some in the early days, but I'm not sure. On the second one, hiring from competition is good. I'll separate both out. As an individual contributor, whatever competitive intel or benefits you're getting is very finite. In fact, you can learn it within an hour or two. An individual contributor only does and knows so much. A sales leader might have a little bit more, but all that competitive intel or Rolodesk is highly, in general, overestimated. It's very finite. And we haven't had any success in hiring from competition. They just haven't met our bar, or they aren't out there enough. But that's my theory on that. Yeah.
Got it.
I wanted to ask a very specific question. Okay, I think I understand what some of these people are trying to ask is, very early on, is it super hard for you to figure out visa issues? Like when you have just 5 sales reps. I think some of the questions are around, can you use a B1 visa and get your guy there and try to do, just how advisable, non-advisable that is, because I've heard a lot of founders ask this in person.
I would say it's a no-no. If you have ambitions of someday becoming a public company, you don't want to do things which are even on the edge of flouting rules in the US, right? So doing business on B1 visa is clear. It's not allowed. I would strongly discourage people from attempting to do it. I know it's the cheapest way, but let's not be short-sighted here.
I would like to combine 2 or 3 questions, very tactical, but there are these questions on should you have a parent entity in the US, how much does it matter, IP, etc. And again, I think Umesh, Vispi, you guys may have different perspectives also, just because of the kind of contract sizes we may be talking about. But any view on whether there are changes to structuring that one might want to do as one moves to the US?
Umesh, you first is, no, I think you first is better. Yeah.
Okay. So look, this is, I know, a debated and almost controversial topic because Sanjeev Bikhchandani had made some comments and there was a lot of war on Twitter about this topic. But my view is very simple. Look, you got to think about what's in the best interest of the company. So there are 2 or 3 issues to consider. If majority of your business is happening in the US, then it just makes sense for several reasons to have your parent legal entity in the US. If majority of your key executives are in the US, it makes sense to have the legal entity in the US. If you've reached a stage or you already know that one of likely outcomes for your company is a US listing, then again, you need to have a legal entity there. Second, in my personal experience, we were for the longest time an Indian headquartered entity, and then we made the shift for all these reasons. And one more thing, post Series B, I realized that the access to capital in India versus access to capital in US, Series C, Series D, Series E type investors, big check investors, there's a huge difference. I first landed here, I remember I went on a Zoom call with one of the founders who had come a year ahead of me. And I said, look, I'm thinking about Series C. Do you have a network? Because most of my network in VCs is in India. On the Zoom call, he opened a spreadsheet. He had 150 names categorized by, if your ARR is 10 to 20 million, here's 5 names. If 20 to 50, here's 5 names, 0 to 5. And he said, where are you? Take a pick. I'll make those introductions. And that's how we started. When I moved there, I probably knew everyone on a phone book basis from an Indian VC network, and that list wasn't that large, right? So access to capital beyond a certain scale, just, India is still not very deep. It's not like India does not have that access to capital, but there's no comparison. So for all the reasons that I mentioned, now, if your core, majority of the business is not US, if US listing is not the key priority, if founders and key executives are not in the US, then it's not a necessary move. I mean, you might still do it for other reasons, but it's not a necessary move. But if some of those conditions are true, then, just it doesn't make sense to not be a US headquartered company.
I'll answer for the customer standpoint. As long it doesn't matter from our customers in the US. US sub is great, but where the parent is doesn't matter. But I'm really curious, Alok and Arpit, does it matter to early stage investors like you in India?
So Vispi, I think first of all, the answer is also changing even in India. Earlier, everybody used to be in India in the beginning and nobody cared. Gradually, the world moved to a little bit of what Umesh is saying. Everybody wanted that you should be a Delaware headquartered company, at least if you can, because flipping becomes very hard. And to be honest, all else being equal, there is no downside of being in Delaware. Actually, you still have even if it is incremental, you have more access to capital out there. And tomorrow, if you are going to get acquired, it just raises fewer questions as well. Yes, the access to capital in India, at least in the last 2 years, has grown dramatically. But I hesitate to say whether this is sort of a pro-SaaS wave that is going on for the last 12 months, which will die down like it has for many spaces in the past. Or is that going to be a secular wave that will just stay? I think time will tell. But still, the access to capital is way more in US. Though I think the number of questions people ask for India headquartered companies have begun to come down. Certainly in the last 12 to 18 months, quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was some data that the amount of money in Indian SaaS in the last 4 or 5 years is probably 5-ish% of the amount of investment in US SaaS. That's happened. So again, the depth of capital available is definitely significantly more. And sorry, one last question, because I think we are going to run out of time pretty soon. This is not in the Q&A panel, but one thing which at least I've heard from a few people is, see, as you start running essentially 2 centers, right? There is one org in India. So initially there was only one India org. Now, little by little, a US org starts to get built up. And then over a period of time, that org, let's just start getting larger. And to be frank, also, people start feeling that power centers maybe start shifting. Plus, you're working across different time zones, not able to see people as much, not able to interact with people as much. Just culturally, from an org building perspective, does that have an impact first? And if yes, what are things that one could do or one should watch out for?
Umesh, I think you have 100 people here out of a total of 350. So I think that would be your answer would be.
Yeah. Again, experiential. When we moved to the US, when the US org began to grow, our Glassdoor rating pre-move to the US was 4.1, went down to 2.7 when the US move was happening. So the culture backlash was huge. It's now 4.4, right? So I can't emphasize this more than that. We had a big backlash. I should have paid more attention. And I thought, I know India, that's my home center, people would understand, but no. You left a center orphan, which was used to having both the founders cut birthday cakes together and things like that. You suddenly became a different center where execs were now being hired there. The power center was being shifted and people felt less empowered. Now, if I were to do it again, I'd do it differently. But to emphasize your question, my data point just highlights that in a big way.
And if I may ask, Umesh, what did you do that went from like the 2.7 to the 4.4? Any best practices that are worth sharing?
I mean, then you basically press reset. Now the org is, when your Glassdoor reaches 2.7, you have to assume other ramification. Attrition goes through the roof, right? Yeah. So essentially you're rebuilding, right? And now the rebuilding is happening with the new set of rules of engagement that US is now established as the bigger power center, the headquarters, and the org is now getting used to that. And once that reset happened, I can say there was nothing fundamentally wrong with our culture in those 3 eras, right? It's just transition that wasn't smoothly handled.
Got it. Unless there are any burning questions, because we promised
we are out of time, and we promise everyone that we'll keep it to exactly 60 minutes. At the closing, I wanted to make one request to everyone who is attending, which is that sometimes we struggle, Arpit and I keep chatting, what is the next topic we should choose? If any of you have thoughts on what could be like a Monday morning topic that you worry about, not long-term strategy, please do DM us. We would love to include the topics that you think will be most useful to you. But thank you, Umesh. Thank you, Vispi. I first of all want to congratulate both of you for the companies that you guys have built. It's just very inspiring to see. And in both the cases, since I've seen these journeys from very early on, it's just amazing to watch these. And thank you for taking out time. Thank you to all the other panelists, Manish, Apurv, Alokik, and everybody who attended. And hopefully we'll be back soon with number 12. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.